What is going on, ladies and gentlefish, and welcome back to another tier list video. Now, dare I even say this, but Brian Moser might genuinely be one of my favorite characters in all of Dexter. Now, I might even like him more than Dexter himself as a character. Now, I truly don't know what it is and why I actually like him more than Dexter, but I just think that Brian was an amazing villain, and I really wish we got to see more of him. Or maybe he just mogs and that's why everybody likes him. I mean, like, oh well. So I've already done a similar video where I ranked which detectives Dexter Morgan could escape from. So this time I wanted to swap Dexter out for Brian and see if he has a better chance against these detectives. Now, Brian is obviously a different type of killer, so some of these matchups could go completely different. But with that being said, let me stop yapping and let's just get straight into it. So coming in at the top tier, we have they catch Brian Moser. They find out his true identity, but they don't put him behind bars because his true identity is Brian Moser. But as we know in season 1, he goes under the name Rudy Cooper. They are suspicious of him, but they really get no evidence to use against him in a court of law. And they find nothing, they find nothing. And coming in first, we have Dewey Riley from Scream. Now, I like Dewey, and he has survived far more Ghostface attacks than anybody reasonably should. But Brian Moser is operating on an entirely different level from most of the killers Dewey investigates. Ghostface killers are usually impulsive and obsessed with creating a dramatic reveal. They chase victims through houses and eventually expose themselves because, they want everyone to hear their motive. Brian Moser is far more controlled than any other Ghostface. The messages inside the crime scenes are mainly designed for Dexter, meaning Dewey wouldn't even really understand what Brian is trying to communicate, and honestly, I don't think Dewey is really that good of an investigator. All the Ghostface killers really just reveal who they are at the end of the movie, so Dewey really doesn't have to do pretty much any he has to do some investigating, but really all the hard work is done by the killer when they reveal themselves. Now, Dewey could potentially survive an encounter with Brian because surviving killers is basically his greatest talent. I mean, he lasted all the way up to, what was it, Scream 5 or 6? So, I mean, genuinely, I don't think Dewey would find really anything. If anything, I think Dewey would love Rudy Cooper and he would try to be friends with him. I'm just gonna be completely honest here. Next, we have Hank from Breaking Bad. Now, Hank is sometimes treated like he is just the loud and comedic DEA agent from the beginning of Breaking Bad, but he's actually an extremely persistent investigator. Once he realizes something is wrong, he can obsess over a case for months, even when everyone around him believes he is wasting his time. Now, Hank is very good at noticing when a person's story looks correct on the surface but doesn't really feel right underneath. That was one of the reasons he remained suspicious during the Heisenberg investigation, even when other agents wanted to close the case, because he was kind of always suspicious of Walter White, even though everyone thought he was just a normal guy. I mean, he looked like it. Now, if he discovered that parts of Rudy's history couldn't be verified, he would dig deeper instead of accepting an easy explanation. Now, Brian could manipulate Hank by feeding his ego, and he might even pretend to admire the investigation and make Hank feel like Rudy was assisting him. Brian is excellent at mirroring what people want to see. Now, Hank might initially enjoy talking to him and never imagine that the helpful specialist was the serial killer. I believe Hank could eventually identify Brian. I don't know if I'm giving him too much, props here. I mean, Hank eventually found out that Walter White was Heisenberg, so I really wouldn't say it's that much of a stretch to say that Hank could eventually find out that Brian Moser is Rudy Cooper, or if Rudy Cooper is Brian Moser. I mean, you could say either or, I don't really know, but maybe he could be in They Are Suspicious, but genuinely, I think you could find out his true identity, but he couldn't put him behind bars. Next, we have Detective Loki from Prisoners. Loki is definitely persistent, but in the movie Prisoners, it also shows what happens when he is presented with a case that doesn't have an obvious answer. The investigation completely consumes him throughout the movie. He becomes frustrated and increasingly desperate as every other lead falls apart or sends him in another direction. Now, that type of determination can be useful, but against someone like Brian, it would become a massive weakness. Loki would know Brian is intelligent, but he wouldn't have enough information to recognize that every murder was part of a private conversation with Dexter. Even if Loki does figure it out and gets that type of information, I still don't think he catches Brian at all. Brian would also notice how deeply the kidnapping case affected Loki. He could keep feeding him misleading clues until Loki became exhausted and started making mistakes. I feel like Rudy Cooper would probably remain completely invisible to Loki, but still I do think that Loki might have his suspicions, or he could find nothing. I mean, who am I kidding? I don't think he would have any suspicion about Rudy Cooper. in my opinion. Next we have Will Graham. Will is probably the detective Brian would fear the most because Will wouldn't merely analyze the crime scenes, he would psychologically reconstruct them from Brian's POV. Most importantly, Will would realize these murders were personal even though the victims appeared random. Brian is not emotionally connected to the women he kills, they are symbols being used in a conversation with Dexter, and Will Graham would notice that almost immediately. Will might sense that Dexter recognized something inside the murders even if Dexter refused to explain it. From there, Will would begin reconstructing the trauma that created both Dexter and Brian. Now, I feel like Brian might actually become fascinated by Will. Both men understand darkness in a way that ordinary people don't, and Brian could believe Will was another person capable of understanding him. That fascination might lead Brian to approach Will, but I feel like that would be a mistake. Every additional message would give Will a clearer image of the man he was hunting, and since Will Graham eventually found out that Hannibal Lecter was the Chesapeake Ripper, of course he didn't get enough evidence to put him behind bars. Hannibal Lecter himself turned himself in. But if Will Graham could find out that Hannibal Lecter is the Chesapeake Ripper, I definitely think that Will Graham could definitely find out that Rudy Cooper is Brian Moser and definitely gather enough evidence to put him behind bars. Next we have David Mills from Seven. Brian's crime scenes would infuriate Mills. The lack of blood and the messages being left behind would convince Mills that the killer was mocking the police. Now, instead of calmly examining why Brian wanted certain bodies discovered in certain locations, Mills would probably become obsessed with catching him as quickly as possible. And as we all know, Mills can become impatient and reckless when a killer appears to be playing games with him, as we've seen with John Doe. And that aggression could produce results. I mean, like, cause persistence is always really good, right? But the emotional side of him being reckless and angry would also, as we've seen at the end of Seven, put him in a bad spot. And I feel like Brian would also target Mills personally if he felt threatened. We already know Mills becomes vulnerable when a case involves someone he loves. Brian would study him, locate his family, and use that emotional connection to force him into making a mistake. Brian might not even need to kill Mills, but he could provoke him into attacking the wrong suspect or breaking procedure. I feel like he could get some suspicion, genuinely. I feel like why not? But then you can argue that Detective Loki may be in the same bracket as David Mills, but next we have Patrick Jane. The moment Jane meets Rudy Cooper, he would know that he is hiding something. It might not be enough to identify him as the ice truck killer, but Brian's expressions and his interactions with Deborah would give Jane information that no background check could provide. And you guys are probably wondering, wait, why would Deborah be in this situation? Well, because every one of these detectives would be working alongside Miami Metro. If you're the person that he suspects, he's going to analyze everything about you, whether you have conversations with different people or conversations with him. Now, the greatest advantage Jane has is his willingness to create traps. Instead of waiting for physical evidence, he could announce to the police that he has discovered the killer's childhood identity or claim that Dexter was being removed from the investigation. And Brian would feel compelled to respond because Dexter is the center of everything he is doing. Jane might deliberately convince Brian that Dexter had rejected the killer's message or that Dexter was helping the police identify him. Because of that, Brian would either approach Dexter, alter his plan, or attempt to eliminate someone he viewed as an obstacle. And the funny thing is, Christian Camargo is actually in The Mentalist, so this is kind of like a cool crossover, but 100% Patrick Jane is definitely putting Brian Moser behind bars. Next we have Russ Cohle. Rust would be completely consumed by the ice truck killer case. The symbolism, the ritualistic displays, and hidden psychological meaning would immediately interest him. While other detectives focused on identifying the victims and examining physical evidence, Russ would study why Brian wanted the bodies presented in that exact way. Russ would understand very early that the killer wasn't simply trying to shock Miami, that the crime scenes were a conversation, and that conversation, he would have to figure out. And eventually down the line, he would know it was going to be with Dexter. And once Russ begins investigating Dexter's childhood, everything starts falling apart for Brian. Rudy Cooper, as we all know, loves charming, and charming would be really hard to do for Russ Cohle. Rudy's friendly personality works because most people want to believe that socially successful and helpful individuals are harmless. And Rust, he doesn't trust appearances at all, and quite frankly, he doesn't really care to talk to anybody or be friendly with anybody, so that just won't work at all. The danger is that Rust might confront Brian alone, and Rust frequently puts himself in situations where backup is either unavailable or unwanted, and Brian is way physically more capable than anybody Russ Cohle has ever went up against in True Detective. Still, I feel like Russ Cohle would eventually put him behind bars, or he could find out his true identity. I don't know, it's kind of a tricky one, but for this one, I would have to say he catches Brian Moser. And last but not least, we have Jim Gordon. For this ranking, I'm judging Gordon mainly as a detective without giving him unlimited access to Batman, because obviously if Batman is actively helping Jim Gordon, Brian's serial killing career is probably over within an hour. Probably 30 seconds, if I'm gonna be honest. Gordon would immediately take the theatrical nature of the murder seriously, because Gotham has taught him when a criminal deliberately creates a spectacle, there is usually a message hidden inside it. Brian has constructed a convincing life, and Gordon would need to connect him to old hospital records and the identity of, the real Rudy Cooper, which I feel like he could possibly do. I mean, like, this is Gotham, for crying out loud. I feel like Jim Gordon, deals with all this stuff on a daily basis. So really, truthfully, I feel like just by scaling Jim Gordon in Gotham every single day, I feel like he definitely could figure out Rudy Cooper's real identity, but I mean, putting him behind bars, probably. I feel like eventually he could, but I don't really see it happening, in my humble opinion. I could be wrong, but who knows? So yeah, let me know what you guys think about this list, and comment your opinions down below, and thank you guys so much for watching.